Greetings, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be invited to share with you some thoughts on China's teacher education and teachers in China today. I've been invited by Professor Jiangming Suan, a very senior scholar at Shanghai Normal University, whom I've known and worked with over many years, and also Professor Cui Bian, who long ago was my doctoral student, studying in both France and also here in Canada, and now a professor in Shanghai Normal University. And I understand all of you today have come from different countries in the Belt and Road arena, where China is reaching out to offer support and organize different kinds of cultural sharing. And it's just my pleasure today to share a little bit of what I have learned over many years from working with very senior scholars in China. I was privileged, starting way back in the 1980s, to support China's universities as they were transformed at the end of the Cultural Revolution. And many of them were normal universities, which is, of course, universities by and for teachers. So I'm going to just share with you a little bit today of what I learned from several of China's very senior teacher education scholars, and a little bit about their ideas about teacher education and how it can be improved and reformed. Here you'll see the cover of a book I published already almost 20 years ago, Portraits of Influential Chinese Educators. The book contains life stories of 11 influential educators whom I was privileged to work with in a joint project that ran from the later 1980s right through to the end of the 1990s. And we worked together, first of all, in developing doctoral programs in education, and then in collaborating in educational research. So I was very privileged to have the opportunity to get to know them. And I'm just going to share a little bit from several of them. But first, I'll begin and say a little bit about the field of teacher education in China and how it's organized. So of the influential educators in the book, all but 5 of them were professors in normal universities and made important contributions to new thinking in teacher education. The oldest was Professor Li Bingde, and he was in the far northwest of China, at Lanzhou, at Northwest Normal University. He had studied, believe it or not, with the famous Jean Piaget in Switzerland back in the 1930s and 1940s, and then come back to China to serve. The second one, Professor Liu Jie, a woman professor, the first woman in China to be a doctoral supervisor in education, and particularly moral education, a leading figure at Nanjing Normal University, who passed away just 2 or 3 years ago. I believe it was actually on Christmas Day of the year 2021. And the third one, Professor Yelan, a leading woman professor at East China Normal University, still active and alive, and has done quite dramatic work in supporting educational reform through teacher education. So it's my pleasure just to share a little of their stories today. And I want to really also emphasize the continuing significance of Confucian thought in China. It's a very fundamental philosophical foundation for education and has a great deal to say relating to teacher education and future directions in teacher education. And the first thing I would say about it is that you see in it a kind of bottom-up approach to reform. I don't think of state Confucianism as a formal set of doctrines, but rather the values and beliefs that inform most people's families and lives from the Confucian tradition. And what I have seen is a kind of rethinking of moral education and core values in teacher education coming out of the Confucian tradition, and also a kind of emphasis on quality in teacher education so as to ensure that efforts at education for all, EFA, is transformative and inclusive. It's not just getting every child into the classroom, it's ensuring that their experience of education is truly transformative. So that's what I want to try to share today. And I find generally outside of China, there are kind of two stereotypes of Confucian education, both really faulty. The first one, Confucianism, a closed hierarchical social order, encouraging subordination, conformism, and something antithetical to any real progress. We saw during China's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s a kind of strong reaction against Confucianism based on this misunderstanding of the reality of Confucian values. And that was actually quite a tragic period for China's education, 1967 to 76. The other stereotype, and interestingly, over a similar time, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, other countries in East Asia, which are regarded as Confucian heritage societies, including South Korea, including Japan, including Vietnam, including places like Hong Kong and Singapore, experienced a very dramatic transformation of education and of teachers in the period after the Second World War. Japan really was first, and then Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, other societies and countries. And people like, well, a number of important Confucian scholars talked about the East Asian miracle. And they said that's because Confucianism stimulates families to work hard and students to be highly disciplined. And yes, there's a lot of truth to that. There's some truth to both of them. But the real value of Confucianism is something much deeper. And here I'm going to quote for a wonderful scholar who spent his life at Columbia University in the US studying the traditions and scholarly values of East Asia, William Theodore de Bary. And he wanted to introduce to North America and the Western world, what are the real values of Confucian philosophy and thought? And I just take a few quotes from his work, which I think tell you a deeper picture than the two stereotypes presented above. It nurtures a sense of self-worth and self-respect, not to be sacrificed for any short-term utilitarian purpose. A sense of place in the world, not to be surrendered to any state or party. A sense of how one could cultivate one's individual powers to meet the social responsibilities that the enjoyment of learning always brought. So that's just a few thoughts about this Confucian tradition, which I think, of course, China has many other traditions, Taoism, Buddhism, other religious traditions in China, from Islam, from Christianity, but Confucianism has been a very dominant one. So I wanted to just begin by sharing some thoughts about the values of Confucianism. And when I tried to interpret the lives of these educators, which I'm going to share with you today, I found reading more deeply into Confucian values and philosophical ideas helped me to interpret their lives and their ideas and their contributions. So I begin with Professor Li Bingde. He was the oldest of the influential educators whom I interviewed, worked with, had the privilege of working with in forming new doctoral students. China really started its serious doctoral programs only after the end of the Cultural Revolution in the 1980s. He lived from 1912 to 2005. He came from a modest family background. He studied in Henan University in Henan province in China before having the opportunity to go to Europe and study with Jean Piaget and other leading educators in Switzerland and France. And then he made up his mind to come back in the late 1940s, actually just the beginning of the 1950s, as China had experienced its revolution and was beginning a whole new period of education. He was assigned to the far Northwest, Northwest Normal University in Lanzhou on his return to China. That was quite demanding for him because he came from a more central part of China, but he embraced that assignment and spent his whole life. He was seen as kind of the father of education in the province of Gansu, where Lanzhou is, and a very important leader in the normal university there. He started off with educational experiments, leading educational experiments at the very basic level. Many of you know, during the Cultural Revolution, China's leading scholars were forced to go down to the countryside, were humiliated in different ways. He was sent down, but he took it as an opportunity to work in rural schools, to experiment with what kinds of education transform children's learning at the most basic local level. And he did that for a number of years. After the end of the Cultural Revolution, he came back. He was president for a short period of time of Northwest Normal University. And then he set himself to nurture a strong cohort of doctoral students who would be future leaders. Included among them, the first Tibetan student who became a doctor of education. And this student is still very active. He's now in Sichuan. We cooperated. He was in Canada, as many of the other students working with Professor Li Bingde. So that just gives you a little idea of him. And I just shared just a few pictures just so you can get a sense of him. You see him there at the top left with his wife as a young man. You see him with his family and young children and family. His wife was a very brave woman. She encouraged him in the late 1930s, early 1940s, even though China was going through all kinds of turbulence. You must take the opportunity to go to Europe and upgrade your qualifications and scholarship. I know you'll come back. And of course he did come back and became a leading figure. And then the third, the biggest, the picture at the bottom, I was delighted to bring him to our institute in Toronto, the Ontario Institute of Studies in Education. In 1992, we held a conference, which we called Knowledge Across Cultures. And the painting that you see behind was painted by a Chinese student. It's got four languages on it. It's got Sanskrit, because we were looking at ancient Indian tradition, Arabic, Middle East, Chinese, and then of course English and French. And here on the far right, you see Professor Li Bingde. He was already over 80 at that time and supervising a number of doctoral students who became very influential. With him, another leading Chinese scholar in moral education, Wang Fengxian, and a student of Professor Li Bingde. I'm going to tell you more about that student in a moment. So what were Professor Li's teacher education ideas? I think the first point was he knew teacher education had to be rooted in Chinese soil. It couldn't be something just borrowed from outside, you know, world standards or models from other countries' experiences. It had to have deep roots in Chinese soil, and he worked on that. But at the same time, be open to ideas from around the world, bring them in, adapt them, integrate them into China's move forward and transformation. And he had a firm commitment to what one might call a bottom-up approach based on experimentation. He was really strong on going into the rural schools, trying out different kinds of pedagogy, observing what enabled the children to love learning and to learn well in all different areas, not only in mathematics, in language, in art, in literature, and also making sure that every child was included, that it wasn't just for the elite or those with good family backgrounds who could afford and gained extra support, but that every child would be involved. And I would describe it as a kind of knowledge in action by consistent responsiveness to emerging needs. China changed so dramatically over these decades, starting in the 1980s up to the end of the Cultural Revolution. So the needs changed regularly. So it was important to observe and see what kinds of qualities new teachers were going to need as the country was transformed through the economic revolution that took place. And now I'm just going to share with you two pictures which are very special to me. The first one, taken in 2017, when I visited Northwest Normal University. I had been there many times. I'd worked with Professor Li, and the scholars there said to me, we're going to visit the grave of Professor Liebing-Dur and remember all his contributions to our province. And so there you see me with some of the leading scholars of Northwest Normal University standing in front of the grave of Professor Liebing-Dur near the city of Lanzhou in Gansu province in Northwest China. And then I want to tell you about perhaps the most remarkable of the doctoral students whom Professor Liebing-Dur nurtured, and we jointly nurtured because he was part of our joint doctoral project, Dr. Wang Jiayi, truly outstanding doctoral graduate from Northwest Normal University. He came to Canada, I believe it was 1992 or 3, almost 30 years ago, for a year to develop his studies and work on his thesis. And then he went back and contributed for 30 years to the province of Gansu. He did significant collaborative experimental work in rural schools and minority schools, collecting statistical data, figuring out how the schools could be transformed. He was vice president of the Normal University, president, and then a leading figure in the Provincial Bureau of Education. And the exciting news I just learned recently, he is now appointed Deputy Education Minister for all of China, I believe beginning July of this year. And to me, this is just a wonderful recognition of the work of Professor Liebing-Dur and the spirit of the scholars he nurtured, not seeking their own advancement or things in their own interest, but rather truly devoted to serving the most needy, the most remote, the rural areas, the schools that needed more attention than the elite urban city schools. And so now Dr. Wang Jiayi, our new Deputy Minister of Education for all of China. I'm so glad to introduce him to you. And I know you are all visiting China for this conference. Maybe you'll have an opportunity to meet him. I've already heard from some of my other colleagues in China who work together with me that he has initiated some new initiatives in teacher education, which doesn't surprise me, given that he's the student of Professor Liebing-Dur. So happy to celebrate this wonderful scholar who's now taken on very important responsibility for the transformation, the ongoing transformation of teacher education in face of very dramatic new challenges with AI, with so many new technological demands and so on for teachers. So just want to celebrate that. And now I'll go on to the second scholar whom I worked with again very, very closely in jointly nurturing doctoral students. A professor at Nanjing Normal University. She was growing up during China's Civil War years, a very, very difficult time for China in the 1930s and 40s. She studied at Jinling Women's College, small liberal arts college in Jiangsu province, under a very wonderful first woman president of a university in China, Professor Wu Yifang, also a strong Christian leader in China. So Lu Jie grew up under the guidance of senior scholars at Jinling and graduated just after the revolution, 1952. Her parents encouraged her to go to the US and study. And I asked her many, many years later, did you ever regret that you didn't do it? No, she said, I was very clear about my calling. I had to stay and serve my own country through a very difficult period of time. So she stayed at the university where she graduated, Nanjing Normal University, developed the field of educational sociology in a very sophisticated way, a lot of interesting scholarly theories from Europe as well as from China and East Asia, and emphasizing very much subjective, the development of the subjective. Each person, not just subordinating himself to rules from above, but going within their deep self to understand what was right, how should they justify that, and how should they go forward. She suffered harsh persecution during the Cultural Revolution because her father had studied with John Dewey in the United States. Her parents were in Hong Kong. She always told him one of her greatest regrets was she brought her parents back and then they suffered severe persecution during the Cultural Revolution. But she overcame all of that, and she initiated a whole new approach to moral education in China. She's best known as the leader of moral education, which emphasized the strengthening of the subjective self. She wrote a great deal. She worked very closely again with rural as well as urban communities, very closely with teachers. And I had a number of her doctoral students coming to Canada, working with us, and I had the opportunity also of visiting very often. Here's a few pictures just to give you a little sense of her. On the far left, you see her parents. Her father was actually from Sichuan. He had studied with John Dewey in Columbia University and then come back to China. Her mother came from a quite aristocratic Shanghai family. So they were kind of unique parents who brought her up and actually felt that it would have been best for her to go abroad, but she made her own choice. And her choice was, no, I'm going to stay in China. And you can see in the top right picture, she loved to work with children. She was always out in the country areas. She had interesting theories to think the ways in which teacher education for rural schools needs to develop may be somewhat different than from urban schools. So how do we think about the difference of the responsibilities of teacher education, either for rural or minority groupings or urban areas where the children tend to be more privileged? The bottom left picture, you can see her giving a paper at a conference, the same conference that Professor Li Bingde came to in 1992 on knowledge across cultures, and that was in our institute in Canada. And then you see her on the beautiful river in Guizhou in the last picture. As I said, she passed away only 2 or 3 years ago. A life really lived to transform education from the bottom up, not through imposition of doctrines or rules from above, but rather deep thought and reflection and spiritual engagement. So I feel I was very, very privileged to know her. She was the head of an educational research institute at Nanjing Normal University. And there she established within that an institute to rethink moral education. Nanjing Normal University is a provincial university, not a national university in China. So it doesn't have quite the influence and prestige of, for example, Peking University or other national universities like Tsinghua or Fudan University. But in moral education, it is a national leader. And the Institute of Moral Education is influential throughout the nation and highly respected. And much of her work led to, and that was very, very important, particularly in the first 10 or 15 years after the Cultural Revolution. There had been so much violence and attack on rules that didn't make sense, really. And so figuring out and thinking through children's social and moral responsibility and nurturing teachers to be able to encourage that through deep reflection, through an understanding of their own moral and philosophical heritage, and also an openness to ideas they might learn from outside. She was very close to the teachers, supporting them in curriculum reform. That was an area where she made a great deal of contributions to enable the development of a curriculum that would empower the children to learn and to love learning. And she had a very special commitment to rural students and teachers, and often visited and found ways to give them opportunities. In a way, you could say she was bridging between the rural and the urban in China, but also the China and the global community. One of her last big conferences, and I heard it was a great success, she invited overseas Chinese from multiple countries around the world, all to come back and to learn together with the local ones in China and to think about what are the new ways in which we have to address educational needs in this 21st century. So really a great leader, and we have so much to be thankful for. When I try to summarize what kind of leadership, I would describe it as a servant leadership. She was briefly, I think, maybe a vice president. She had some administrative leadership, but her leadership was much more the leadership of a scholar seeking to serve, nurturing strong autonomy in relation to family, She insisted that she was right not to obey her parents, even though Confucian traditions would say, if your parents say you have to go, you go. No, she made her own choice. And she felt that was very important. But also in relation to the political system. So a deep sense of self-awareness and self-knowledge. I do a lot of translation from Chinese to English, and I always have a little problem with our word autonomy, because in if you translate it directly into Chinese, it's self-governance, the second one you see here, 自治, self-rule or self-governance. But actually, the much better translation that fits with the thinking of a Lu Jie and of Chinese people more generally is self-mastery, knowing yourself to the point that you know what you have to contribute and how. And China has been blessed with many intellectual leaders who had the courage to be critical, had the courage to bring very new and different ideas because of this notion of autonomy rooted in their own culture. I also saw in her a beautiful spirit of forgiveness. Her family suffered a lot. Her parents suffered terribly during the Cultural Revolution. She described to me what it was like to have Red Guards come into her house and take all the books down and smash them and burn. But after that was over, instead of saying, I'm going to pay them back, she wanted to do the only good, to restore and rethink and transform China's education. So a very wonderful example, I think, of a teacher education leader who had a tremendous influence over a long period of time. And also, I had mentioned earlier, she made big efforts to connect with the Chinese diaspora all around the world and to bring some of the richness of China's cultural traditions and views of knowledge and understanding into the global society, which has tended to be dominated by certain Western models that have been very influential, particularly in areas like global ranking of universities and so on. I always say to myself, where are the normal universities in the global ranking? Those are institutions where China could really bring some very rich thoughts rooted in its own tradition into the global arena. And that was the kind of role that Lu Jie, Professor Lu Jie, had. So I'm very grateful for having known her. I still keep in touch with many of her students who feel tremendously blessed to have been able to work under her as a doctoral student or a postdoc. And I'm actually engaged right now in translating a narrative that she wrote, because I feel her experiences through all the decades of China's change and her reflections on them are such a valuable heritage that should be read not only in China, but also more widely. So I hope that book will come out at some point before too long. So I also want now to share with you, I showed you the book of the influential educators. These were not translations, they were stories, they were portraits. Some of these educators, including Professor Li Bingde and Lu Jie, never wrote a line in English. And this was very much in my heart over the years since I published their portraits, to have their work translated. And finally, I was able to do it. And so this book just came out in 2022. I want to recommend it to all of you. We've called it Authentic Chinese Educational Thought. 5 articles written by Professor Li Bingde, selected by his doctoral students as the ones that best represent his thinking and his ideas. And those are the first 5 in the book. So I recommend, if you want to know a little more of Chinese educational thought and teacher education, you can find that here. And then with Professor Lu Jie, we actually invited her, please choose for us. She was still living when we planned this book and prepared it. Please choose the 5 of your publications that you feel are most valuable and will have the most to say to a wider global community. So we do, I think we actually have 6 pieces of Lu Jie in the book, the first English translations of their writings. So I just want to recommend this to you. Hope you will be able to find it and be able to get a deeper sense of their thinking and what that could contribute in the different countries that you represent along China's Belt and Road. Finally, I come to the youngest of the 11 educators in my book. She's still alive, in her 80s now, Professor Ye Lan at the East China Normal University in Shanghai. She was the daughter of an elementary school teacher and artist. And her first contribution was very, very interesting. She actually had a chance to study abroad, I think it was 1 year in Yugoslavia. She came back, and then during the Cultural Revolution, she offered to go to Tibet and set up an institution for teacher education. This was during the Cultural Revolution, very, very difficult time. She left her young son with her husband and his family. She traveled to Tibet, and she went to the most remote rural areas of Tibet to help build up a schooling system and nurture teachers. I had the experience of being with her at a number of conferences, and I always found the Tibetan teachers would immediately run for her. She was their idol because she had done so much, and they recognized. I believe now the University of Tibet developed from the institution that she initiated in a very, very tough time during the Cultural Revolution. And then out of that experience, she developed a whole new approach to educational reform. It's called life practice ecology. And the main point, I've talked with her a lot and learned from her, she said, I don't want to pick up models from outside that won't fit in China. We have to begin within. We have to begin to transform a school from the most remote and difficult places, enable the teachers and the students to be energized to bring about the transformation. And so she developed a whole approach to educational reform, which has become quite famous in China and widely influential in schools around the country. Here you can see a few pictures of her as a young woman when she went to Tibet, and you can see her in her teacher's gown in Tibet, now as a scholar sharing her ideas and surrounded by colleagues working with her. What you see there in Chinese, 新基础教育, new basic education. And this is the group of people she's working with in this whole movement for basic education. Like Professor Lu Jie, people offered her leadership. She was briefly vice president at East China Normal University, but she felt it was much more important to get out and work with the schools and the teachers to bring about transformation. And so she developed this whole movement of life practice education. And you can see here in the bottom left corner, speaking with some of the students. So what kind of leadership did she bring to teacher education? Beginning with the most remote and weakest schools, originally in Tibet, then in the suburbs of Shanghai, the schools that nobody wanted to go to because they were poor, they were remote, nobody was interested. Work with them, energize them to transform from within. So involving everyone in the school in a transformation from within, and developing theory coming out of practice that worked, analyzing the practice that worked and seeing what was effective and why was it effective. I particularly like her idea of a system of breakthrough points. It has to begin with things like making sure the school gate is in good shape, making sure the property is beautifully looked after, everyone feeling responsibility for every element of what happens in the school. And she called it a system of breakthrough points. Another phrase she used, to climb out of a deep gully. She was working with schools that felt they were in a deep gully. And how do you enable and energize them to climb out? So very, very visionary. As I said, she was vice president briefly, but mainly gave her heart to developing this new basic education. And like Lu Jie, ensuring that students developed self-knowledge and had a sense of control over their environment, rather than just feeling, oh, we just have to do what we're told. What can we do to bring about change? I believe her philosophical roots really could be seen as rooted in very famous Neo-Confucian scholar Wang Yangming, and what was called scholarship of the heart. He emphasized not memorizing texts, not traditional recitation and so on, but rather knowledge coming out of action, action that transforms, then being reflected on to bring knowledge and understanding. And the school is called Xinxue in Chinese, the school of the heart. So a beautiful example of that. So I know China's current time with all the successes of their economy and educational system is very willing and eager to share some of their lessons, some of the richness coming out of their cultural traditions and from their leading educators. And I just want to say, I have been greatly enriched. I've been very blessed to be able to work with these educators. And I'm very happy and thankful today to have this opportunity just to share this with you. And I'll just close by letting you know that you can actually buy a book with a large number of Professor Yeland's articles and writings translated into English. And this was already done. I can't take responsibility for this one. This book just came out, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. It's available. I believe it's published by Brill. And I'm so thankful that teacher educators around the whole region, because of this translation, even if they're not able to read or understand Chinese, would be able to benefit from reading her work. So I'm going to close here. I'm just going to say it's a very great privilege to be associated with Shanghai Normal University in this conference that you're having on teacher education and teachers transformation. I want to wish you a wonderful time at the conference. I have to say Shanghai is a beloved city for me. I lived there for 2 years and I've visited many, many times. Most recently, I haven't been able to come back, but hope to do so in the future. So I wish you all blessings in your conference, and I hope you'll be enriched by this opportunity to learn from China's teachers and from teacher education in China. Thank you.